Thank you very much, Jonathan. They do say when you speak in the United States of America that if you speak with an English accent, it doesn't matter what you say, people are going to think you're intelligent anyway. I'm not sure if that applies here in Israel. I suspect it probably doesn't. But I can compensate for that by having been educated here at the IDC under the command of Jonathan back in 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, 63 years ago tomorrow, in September 1950, United Nations air and naval forces began an amphibious invasion of Incheon on the Korean peninsula with a series of devastating airstrikes. Incheon was one of the most brilliant and decisive operations in modern warfare, conceived and commanded by American General Douglas MacArthur, perhaps the greatest general of modern times, present company accepted, of course, General. But what has the Battle of Incheon got to do with counter-terrorism today? You may very well be wondering. Whenever I think of intervention in Syria, I think of Incheon. Although the proposed Incheon operation was obviously kept very much under wraps, virtually everybody who knew about it opposed it. Incheon was stridently opposed by the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, by many in the White House, and even by General MacArthur's own personal staff. I can't comment on the views about Syria today among serving British officers, but I know that I've only heard one retired British general speak in support of military intervention in Syria, and many speaking against it. Polls in the UK tell us that the majority of the British population, by 4-1, do not support military intervention in Syria. I suspect the picture is not too dissimilar in Europe and in the United States. In the case of both Incheon and Syria, I can understand the strong opposition. One member of the Incheon planning staff said, "Make up a list of amphibious don'ts, and you have an exact description of the Incheon operation." Well, if you made up a list of military intervention don'ts, Syria ticks pretty much every box, except one, and that box is deterrence. When you look at the stakes, you have to ask yourself whether the potential deterrent value of a strike against the Syrian regime outweighs all of the potential horrors and nightmare scenarios that could well follow it. And I obviously don't need to mention any of those to this audience here in this country, which could well be more immediately and severely affected by the fallout than any other country in the world. However, against the background of today's terrorist threat and tomorrow's, deterrence, in my view, has never been more important. Al-Qaeda Central, devastated and reeling from a highly successful, sustained campaign of drone attacks in the Pakistan tribal areas, is desperate to find a way of reasserting itself. Chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons have long been high on its priority list and remain so. Both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda will soon be presenting the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan as a bloody nose for the West. Unless things change dramatically very quickly. They will have plenty of ammunition to support their propaganda. Only this week, General Mark Milley, the commander of ISAF Joint Command in Afghanistan, said that between 50 and 100 Afghan soldiers are killed in battle every single week in Afghanistan today, a figure comparable to American military losses in Vietnam. It is most likely that large swathes of southern and eastern Afghanistan will again fall under the control of the Taliban. It's also highly likely that the United States will carry on a drone warfare campaign similar to that in Pakistan, working to prevent insurgents developing enough power to threaten Kabul and to prevent extremists from establishing a base in Afghanistan to again threaten the West. But whatever the reality on the ground, and however we may wish to portray that reality, the jihadists will plausibly paint the picture of Afghanistan as a major victory for them and a major defeat for us. It will be a much-needed shot in the arm for al-Qaeda in that region and globally, and we will see the positive effects on support, funding, recruitment, and morale among their followers. The security vacuum in southern and eastern Afghanistan will also open up the potential for a relatively safe haven for the Pakistan Taliban's campaign against the government of Pakistan. It is not yet clear what effect this could have on their insurgency inside Pakistan, but it perhaps does deepen concerns about the security of Pakistan's own weapons of mass destruction. And of course, the Pakistan Taliban, like the Afghan Taliban, is closely allied to al-Qaeda. A network with global ambition, including against the United States homeland, the Pakistan Taliban has also reportedly sent hundreds of fighters to join the rebels in Syria and has established its own base there. Coming back home, the development of Iran's nuclear program is not only concerning from the perspective of the Ayatollah's possession of nuclear weapons, but whom they might share nuclear and radiological material with. Hezbollah, very possibly. And just because, ladies and gentlemen, al-Qaeda and Hezbollah are currently in the process of killing each other in Syria, does not mean that Shia Iran would balk at providing Sunni al-Qaeda with WMD if they judged it in their interests to do so. The same could be true of North Korea, which, as well as nuclear, has stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, and according to some sources, has supplied arms to al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and Hamas in the past. And full circle, back into Syria, where the risk remains, whatever the West does or does not do, that chemical weapons might well come into the hands of the rebels. Short of being able to seize or destroy all of those potential terrorist sources of WMD, deterrence is the only real answer. Unfortunately, whichever way Congress votes tomorrow, and whatever President Obama decides to do or not do, that deterrence has already been seriously undermined and diminished. Lengthy and very public deliberation, indecision, order and counter-order, exposure of splits between and within Western nations, isolation of national leaders, the thin red line becoming the thin grey line. All of this may well be democracy at its best, but it does not make for effective deterrence. Prime Minister Cameron's very public and vocal call for action against the Syrian regime followed swiftly by his defeat in Parliament and Britain's self-exclusion from any military intervention, does not make for effective deterrence. Britain once ruled over the greatest empire the world has ever known. Today, it's a very different picture indeed. But nevertheless, Britain's voice does remain important. Our generals are often accused of fighting the last war, while Britain's parliamentarians are now in that position as well. During their debate, the ghost of Iraq hung over the House of Commons, even though, despite some superficial similarities, the two situations are very different indeed. But another spectre dominated Britain's decision even more than Iraq. Jonathan Ayal of the Royal United Services Institute in London said that the most telling phrase from debaters on Syria was this: "Our job in Parliament is to look after our own people," betraying ignorance or more likely willful blindness to the reality that what extremists perpetrate on their own people today, they will bring to our shores tomorrow. The haunting fear behind this parliamentary sentiment spells out the word appeasement. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, in 1940, when many British politicians argued for an accommodation with Nazi Germany instead of a fight. And it is very possible that back then a vote in Parliament might have brought that accommodation to reality. But there was no vote in Parliament because Winston Churchill won the day by force of will and sublime moral leadership. The disease of appeasement today is not confined to Britain alone. It infects much of the Western world and Europe in particular. Seemingly, however, other than France, over this issue at least. I never thought I would hear myself saying a good thing about the French. I'm sorry if there's any French people here, but it's nothing personal. But although France may be America's oldest ally, they are our natural enemy. And let us not forget who France allied themselves with America against back in 1778. Too many in Europe are determined to see the threat from Islamist terrorism as one of our own making, and of course Israel's, and would prefer to sell out their own principles, their own culture, and their own moral standards, and of course your country, rather than to make a stand. I have nothing but admiration for the professionals involved in the physical war on terrorism in the UK and overseas, such as Commissioner Leppard, who is here with us today, and Assistant Commissioner Cressida Dick, who you heard from this morning, and their opposite numbers in Europe. The work they do, often in conjunction with our closest allies, such as the United States and Israel, has been instrumental in preventing many terrorist plots and saving many lives. My own concern is with the intellectual war on terrorism, upon which the future prosecution of the physical war depends to such a great extent. There is a view, widely held in Europe, that our withdrawal from Afghanistan, following on from our withdrawal from Iraq, will appease those parts of the population who wish to oppose our national foreign policy by suicide attack on the underground and by hacking off our soldiers' heads on the streets of London. There is a view that any form of forward defence, such as continued substantial engagement in Afghanistan, targeted assassinations against al-Qaeda leaders who are plotting to kill us, or a deterrent strike against Syria, will bring down upon us the wrath of Muslim extremists at home and abroad. Instead, some, perhaps the majority even, believe that we should withdraw into our island fortress, which is far from a fortress these days, rely on our metal detectors and body scanners, and give up whatever ground we need to give up in order to appease those at home who might still wish us harm. As Winston Churchill said, the acts we engage in for appeasement today, we will have to remedy at far greater cost and remorse tomorrow. For evidence of this, you need to look no further than here in this country. As you know better than I do, 800 lethal rockets were fired by Palestinian terrorists at Israeli civilians last year. And despite 20 separate letters sent by the Israeli government to Ban Ki-moon appealing to the UN to take action, warning him that inaction today could help ignite an escalation of conflict tomorrow, Ban Ki-moon and the Security Council took no action and did not even once speak out against this terrorist onslaught. Instead, the United Nations, the European Union, and Western powers continued to appease the terrorists of Hamas, and as a consequence, over 150 people were killed when Israel was forced to launch Operation Pillar of Defense in November. Thankfully, Israel still understands one thing that many of us seem increasingly to forget. Our terrorist enemies are not weak, and we cannot afford ourselves to be weak or to be seen to be weak. Thank goodness that Israel destroyed Syria's nuclear program 6 years ago this week, despite very real fears here that it could trigger retaliation or even war. If Israel had not acted, I very much doubt anybody would be so much as contemplating a punitive strike against a nuclear-armed Syria. In contrast to the West prevaricating and procrastinating and worrying and wondering, Israel has, allegedly, carried out airstrikes in Syria 3 times already this year, and I emphasize allegedly, against targets that the Prime Minister determined threatened the security of his nation. And back in the 30s, a young British Army captain called Ord Wingate taught the Jewish communities here in Palestine, besieged by murderous Arab gangs who wanted to drive them from their land, that attack is the best form of defense. And in so doing, he helped sow the seeds of Israel's doctrine of national security. In this global war on terrorism, instead of taking counsel of our fears, instead of appeasing our sworn enemies, we can learn today from Israel's moral resolve and Israel's indefatigable courage, itself reminiscent of Britain alone after Churchill's will prevailed in 1940. Thank you.